So, I wrote and scripted this entire episode, and I went to one of my friends to talk about what I'm going to talk about, and they said, hey, you should read Astro City. And I said, I've never read Astro City, and most people who suggest things to me are wrong, but I decided to listen to them. And after reading 5 volumes in a day, I realized that I could sum up this entire video by just saying read Astro City, because it solves all of the problems that I'm going to talk about. So I feel really silly now, because I could sum up this entire episode by just going, read Astro City, it's better. And I want to say that the reason I didn't read Astro City originally was because, I don't know, I looked at it and I went, all the heroes are kind of pastiches, and it doesn't really look all that interesting, and I just kind of passed on it, and I was wrong, because Astro City is a series about the world that has superheroes in it, and not so much about the heroes themselves. I mean, most of them are character stories, but what we'll talk about gets into this, because Marvel and DC have problems, as do Image, as do Dark Horse, and I'm going to get into all of this, but I'm going to say that Astro City solves this problem by making their comic about people who live in a world that has superheroes in it, as opposed to making traditional stories that involve superheroes, and that's why it works. But it also completely disregards and goes against every vibe and change in the comics industry that has been there for like the last 40 years. It acknowledges them and digs through them, but it doesn't adhere to them. But without further ado, let's dig into the episode proper so that I can actually explain what I'm talking about, because today we're going to be talking about the problems with modern comics. So, to begin, comics have a really long history, okay? At this point, comics are so old that we often forget that most of our grandparents or great-grandparents read comics and were aware of comics, okay? As the World War II generation dies, for example, my grandparents have all died, it's sort of really hard to remember that they were familiar with characters like Superman and Captain America in the same way that we are today. And it's not to say that the comics they read and knew about were the same, that the comics that we read and know about today were like the ones then. In fact, in my opinion, the two things that exist now that didn't exist then that make comics uniquely worse across the board exist. Okay? It's a problem that exists in every company, across every medium. It exists in cartoons, it exists in movies, it exists in television shows, and it exists in the comics themselves, okay? It exists in Marvel, in DC, in Dark Horse, in Image. These two problems are kind of, in my opinion, actively weaved into comics in a way that they weren't before or originally. So let's start with the most obvious one. Okay, comics have often what I call the zombie or vampire problem. Okay, what I mean is that superheroes have been pop culture for so long that everybody already knows what they are. Okay, you know how in zombie movies someone will see a zombie and go, oh my god, what's going on? And it seems very weird because the movie is ostensibly set in a world that's meant to be like ours. And here's a question, having posed that. Why is that weird? It's weird because zombies have been such a strong part of our culture that for people to not know what a zombie is, that means that this culture or world diverged at least as far back as Night of the Living Dead, which is a movie that came out in 1968. Okay, to put that in context, my parents were 7 years old. Okay, so for some people listening, your grandparents were either teenagers or children when that movie came out. Okay, think about how long ago that was. All right, think about how much has been done with zombies since that point. Okay, in order for a person to not know what a zombie is, that means that they've either somehow missed the cultural domination of this idea of the zombie, or it doesn't exist in this universe that's being shown to us. And if it doesn't exist in this universe, then how can we consider it like our own when this is an idea that is so natural to us? So imagine, in comparison, if you entered a world and somebody went, wow, what if there were lights in the sky? You'd suddenly have to ask things like, wait, does this world not have stars? It would take you completely out of the story because this is such a fundamental thing that we don't even think about. So what does this have to do with superheroes? Superheroes in our real world have existed for a very long time, but they've also existed for a very long time in nearly every superhero universe. Okay? In nearly every universe, from Marvel to Black Hammer, superheroes are accepted to have come into vogue usually during World War I or II. Many of the Golden Age heroes, such as Green Arrow or Captain America, fought the Nazis as part of their backstory. Okay, so that means for most of us, superheroes were familiar to what would be our grandparents and great-grandparents. Superheroes have now been around for nearly 4 generations in-universe. Okay, so by now, superheroes are not a new thing in the universe. They really can't be, because everybody recognizes that heroes existed nearly a century ago. Okay, we don't think that radio is a strange thing. Why would we think that superheroes are a strange thing if they've existed for roughly the same amount of time? Having said that, a great many comics are quite literally about the question of why you need superheroes, which to me is very weird. So at the time of this writing, DC is literally back to beating the drum of, what if superheroes are actually the villains? Which, again, is a weird thing to ask because, again, superheroes have been around for almost a century, and so have supervillains? At this point in time, within the universes that they're taking place in, both heroes and villains came into being roughly 100 years ago. So during World War II, most comic universes say that both the Nazis and the Communists fielded superpowered beings. Okay? Furthermore, there have been generations of globe-spanning threats, such as alien gods, regular gods, magic, underground civilizations, Atlantis, and every other weird idea that you can possibly think of. So in order to come to the conclusion that superheroes are the problem, you have to ignore the mountain of evidence to the contrary. If Captain America didn't exist, the Nazi superpowered beings like Red Skull and Hydra would still exist. If you removed Superman, Mongol and Darkseid still exist. They're still out there. They're still dangerous. These beings do not exist because heroes exist. If you removed the Fantastic Four and, threw them into jail or banished them from reality, Galactus could still eat the planet. So to come to the conclusion that superheroes within the universe itself do not need to exist, or are actually the problem, you need to also believe that if they were removed today, that there would be no problems, or that the villains would suddenly disappear and not exist. It's essentially the Incredibles problem, or premise, I guess you can say, where superheroes are outlawed and then suddenly all of the villains they fought apparently just stopped being villains because there were no more heroes to exist. Like, that's the underlying premise. Alternatively, you could believe that the superheroes existing creates a permission structure for villains to exist. But if you believe that, you have to contend with the fact that most supervillains do not come into existence because of heroes at all. The Batman animated series actually explores this concept very well when the villains put Batman on trial, essentially blaming him for them doing all kinds of bad things. The episode in question is called Trial. And the question posed in that episode is whether or not Batman is actually the cause of all of these, supervillains existing. And this is quickly dispelled when it turns out that all of their backgrounds and motives are, unrelated to Batman. Okay, Batman did not make the Mad Hatter decide to brainwash a woman and try to make her love him. Alright, Batman did not make Man-Bat serum and drink it. He didn't throw acid in Two-Face's face. Okay, he didn't make Firefly burn down buildings. But, okay, what about the questions that are posed in things like Marvel's Civil War? Or, if you want to go further, things like, Watchmen. Okay, the general consensus in these comics is that the issue isn't that heroes are needed, it's that they're unaccountable and thus need to be controlled by some other force, like the government or the police. Essentially, what they're arguing is that what Iron Man needs is to be a cop. This is really stupid on its face for two reasons. One, because everybody knows that governments do bad and corrupt things all of the time. So, in the real world, for example, they gave smallpox blankets to Native Americans, and they also knowingly put their own soldiers near vats of Agent Orange, which gave them cancer. Okay? Second, cops are also often extremely corrupt, both in real life and in comics. So, take Batman, for example, take Gotham City. In movies, in cartoons, in the comics, all of them seem to agree that the GCPD are just horribly corrupt. From top to bottom, they are essentially all corrupt. Does anyone seriously believe that making Batman a member of the GCPD would make anything better? Would that make him more accountable or less corrupt? Imagine if you made Spider-Man a member of the NYPD. Would that make him more accountable? The only way that would be the case is if you believe that cops are somehow always accountable to the public and never do anything wrong or corrupt or abusive in any way, which just doesn't reflect reality, but it also extremely does not reflect superhero universes at all. In the Marvel universe, Kingpin, the Kingpin of crime, was mayor of New York City for years. Again, having in the past literally never changing his name from Kingpin and doing all kinds of horrible stuff. And yet he's still the mayor and he's still the law. Does having Spider-Man as his employee somehow make that better? In Marvel's Civil War, that ends with Green Goblin running a government agency and using basically knockoff Avengers to do horrible things. Are they somehow less corrupt than the system that existed before this? No, this is a stupid idea and a stupid concept for making things better. On its face. We live in the real world. And so, if you said, yeah, let's, take the cops of Baltimore or Minneapolis or anywhere else, and let's give them superpowers. That is not a recipe for anything good. At all, on its face. This is not a solution to this problem. What it is an appeal to authority. It essentially goes, the problem with heroes is that they don't have the backing of the federal government or the state. And so, the only thing that they're missing is the FBI's personal signature on whatever they do. That's all that does. It is a terrible idea. So, having said all of this, why do heroes even exist? Let's get to that, because this is another problem in most comic book universes. Let's ask and dwell on the question of, why are heroes still coming into being, and why do they act at all? Okay, why are heroes needed in universe, and why do they need to be independent of government bodies? And the answer to this is simple. Because there are threats and issues that require people who can act independently within these universes, a thing that makes sense for them because powers are now a fact of life in these worlds. Okay, in our real world, vigilantes are bad and don't exist to solve problems as they actually exist. Okay, Jim Bob with his shotgun rounding up people he thinks are bad looks a lot more like a lynching than it does a superhero. But in a superhero universe, heroes are usually the only people who can step up and deal with, say, the Mole Man, who's decided to dig under New York City and just collapse entire skyscrapers. More importantly, it keeps the taxpayer from having to fund Iron Man's suits. It keeps them from having to do things like having to insure Captain America and give him workers' comp if he gets shot, which he does a lot. Also, everybody gets to have plausible deniability. No one ever has to ask, hey, why aren't cops able to stop Sinestro? To see this stupid concept on full display, Marvel, at the time of this recording, is running an event called Gang War. Alright? Heroes were outlawed under Mayor Kingpin, which was his official name, because of course it was. And so, they're still outlawed in New York City. Heroes are not allowed to operate. However, it turns out, all the superpowered gangs, they still exist, and they're burning the city to the ground. Now, during this event, there are two things that are super stupid on its face that happened during this event that I feel the need to point out because they are so stupid that they actually made me facepalm. Alright, the first is that there's a press conference where J. Jonah Jameson complains that the cops are outgunned and that Mayor Cage wants to bring the heroes back. He's complaining on both sides of the issue. He's saying that, okay, the cops, they can't do anything, but also heroes shouldn't exist. What do you want? What exactly is a person in this position meant to do? Alright, if the opinion of your detractor is, you're just sending them out to die, there's no other option. Okay, you either send the cops out to fight, the Hand, or you have to have superheroes, because there's no other option. Okay? Like, you either have to empower the police and have heroes solve the problem. Those are your two options. It's one or the other. You can argue that we don't need heroes and that the police are enough, but that's transparently not the case. Because in universe, the city is literally being burned to the ground as they talk about this. Okay? This also leads to an extremely stupid moment where Luke Cage jumps in front of a cop that's about to be shot. Okay? And the person who he's just saved points his gun at Luke Cage and says that if you do anything else, Mr. Mayor, I'll have to arrest you. What? That's so incredibly, impossibly moronic. It's like, how do you write this and put it down and not, immediately have a brain aneurysm from how stupid this is? It's doubly stupid because he's doing this while they're being attacked by giant robots. How dare you save me, Mayor Cage, from being murdered by a giant robot? You need to go to jail. Oh, the giant robots? Yeah, we can't do anything about those. We're just gonna let them rampage. This is not a good system. This does not make any sense. None of this is internally coherent or logical or rational. None of this makes any sense. Okay? It's dumb on its face. The logic appears to be that people are meant to hate superheroes, which again have existed for 4 generations since World War II, but they're also supposed to think that they're the problem while superpowered gangs are trying to kill them. Okay, this is where we get into the second problem that all superhero stories really have these days. This is a problem that exists across the spectrum in nearly all companies that causes this weird, illogical Gordian knot. Okay? That did not exist in the golden age of comics. Okay? The problem is that everyone is far too cynical and far too pessimistic about everything. Okay? Superhero stories are, by design, hopeful and optimistic stories. They are born out of an age where people wanted to believe that the future was going to be better than the past. Okay? That people became heroes were doing it for good reasons. Heroes existed to make the world better. Science would improve the world, and things like science could do nearly anything. Now, comics and people are so jaded and bitter that the idea that a hero might want to do good on its own is treated with skepticism and disdain. A hero who is not suffering from some kind of crippling addiction or mental affliction is seen as being too perfect, a Mary Sue. A person who simply wants to do good is seen as being unrealistic. Science is treated with outright hostility or suspicion, with the idea that science won't make the world better, it's only going to create new threats. The implicit position taken across nearly every comic universe is that the status quo is the best that we can have, that heroes are only doing it because they're flawed and desperate, and the world will never improve, that the world cannot improve, that anything that happens will inevitably make the world worse than it currently is. In other words, this means that another Spider-Man who appears to try to be good like his own hero can only make the world worse, because the underlying assumption is that more superheroes means more crime, because any deviation from the status quo means that things will be worse. Any scientific advancement will be used for evil, assuming that they don't try to retcon it later into something that's monumentally worse. Take, for example, the Hulk. On its face, it's transparently a Jekyll and Hyde situation. It's also born of the fact that Stan Lee really loved the idea of things becoming other things. It's why all of the Avengers are people who become other things, alright? Thor is not a god, he's a man who becomes a god. Captain America is a nerd who becomes a Superman. Iron Man is a dude who puts on a suit. The Hulk is a scientist who becomes the Hulk. Ant-Man and the Wasp are scientists who shrink down. That's what he was really interested in. But on another level, the Hulk is a story about the possible effects of science and the dangers they pose. But it's deeper than that. Banner only becomes the Hulk by trying to do something good, and once he realizes he's become the Hulk, he tries to do what he thinks is best by trying to avoid others. Yet, he also understands that the Hulk has its uses, that the Hulk can in fact do good, and over time, this was a thing that was leaned into. It was taken as a given that the Hulk is important, that he's dangerous, but he possesses a real ability to do good. This has been entirely removed from the character. Now, he's connected to some being called the One Under All, which is basically the most evil thing ever. The Hulk is characterized as a being that can never do good, that any good that happens is accidental, that there is no possible way for the Hulk to be good no matter how hard he tries, because he's literally channeling the most evil thing in existence. Banner himself is characterized as a man with severe mental illness, with severe daddy issues, who is dangerous to literally everyone around him, and no one can trust or like him, because he's basically just a walking force of destruction, and it's only a matter of time before he kills everybody around him. This, I think it's obvious, is a remarkably cynical take. It's also the same idea that leads to Iron Man can only build giant robots to kill everyone, and mutants can never be considered people because they're all nuclear weapons waiting to explode, and the best Africa can hope for is a xenophobic militant monarchy that enforces a caste system. In other words, problems cannot be solved. Everything is intractable and static. The status quo is the best anyone can do, so then, let's just ask the question, if everyone believes this, why exactly is anyone doing anything in universe? Remember, there's an entire arc in Marvel about shooting the Hulk into space, and Hulk being mad that they sent him somewhere else, that they betrayed him. Except, there's no reason for this, because if he believes he's dangerous, that he shouldn't, just ask to be sent into a black hole or something. The idea that the world and people are innately bad, that the future is a worse place that cannot be made better, is incompatible with superheroes. It is incompatible with the very concept of heroes or a heroic universe. If you start from such a cynical place, then what you end up with is an inconsistency, where Superman can only be a selfish person for not saving literally everyone, rather than someone who is doing his best despite being only one man. You end up with the idea that Iron Man is one man who cannot improve anything with his ideas. He can only make the world worse with every invention he makes. You're left with a world where superheroes aren't there to try and fix the intractable problems that exist. They are part of the problem. Okay, people like to say that superheroes are our modern myths, but if that's true, then they're being treated as the monsters. People characterize Spider-Man the way they characterize the Hydra, as a dangerous being that rampages and does whatever he wants. Superman is no longer Achilles, a strong man with one weakness, doing what he believes is the correct choice, even if it's not actually the correct choice. He's now Zeus, a being who causes chaos wherever he goes. That's entirely backwards. In this formulation, Captain America isn't a man who wanted to sign up with the military to try and do good. He's a man who actively made the world worse by being the first successful super soldier, and who now makes the world actively worse while still existing within it. The same way that the world serpent in Norse mythology is a big dangerous existence that will one day kill a god that everybody likes. In this cynical formulation, there's no counterbalance to anything. Villains make the world worse, obviously, but heroes also make the world worse. Superpowers themselves make the world worse. Change makes the world worse. Science makes the world worse. Superheroes are not meant to be a conservative concept. They are not meant to look at the world and decide that, no, actually, it can't be saved, and there's no point to any of this. That they themselves are a danger to it, and actually make the world worse by existing. They are not meant to all be mentally unwell individuals who only do things because they cannot function without the meaning that hurting other people gives them, the way that Batman is usually characterized these days. It's a fundamental shift that actively causes problems across all companies and all mediums. It's the sort of formulation that gives rise to things like The Boys, written by a man who actively hates superheroes, and who wrote it to show how much he hates them. They are not meant to be what heroes are supposed to be. They are meant to be an expression of how awful the writer thinks superhero comics are. Superman is not meant to be fundamentally the same as Ultraman. The question of, is this particular hero doing a good job, is entirely different from the question of, are heroes themselves needed or good? Because in-universe, the question does not make sense from the in-universe perspective. To assume that the world would be better without Superman, the question then has to be asked, so what's the plan when aliens come to conquer the Earth? Do you believe that the governments of Earth are prepared to handle that? Because in-universe, that's not a theoretical question. That's a real problem that exists. Removing superheroes and super science doesn't stop Galactus from rocking up to your planet and eating it. Without the moral outlook that the future can be made better, and that superheroes are an optimistic ideal of a person trying to step up when the moment presents himself, even if they fail, you're left with a paranoid tone where everything and everyone is a threat and a danger, and there's no joy or desire to do anything except huddle in a bunker and wait for the end. Comics should not have the same vibe and belief system of doomsday preppers. They are not, by design, conservative in their outlook. They are idealistic in the idea that the world can be made better, and that working to make it better is worth doing. Without that concept, the entire underlying logic of comics breaks down and collapses under its own weight.